I'm back. Smells like albedo. That is hardly an appropriate thing to say, Leanne, Clara said. Doesn't change the fact that it smells like albedo. Leanne wrinkled her nose. Do you think she realizes it? Actually, why don't you say anything since you're all buddy-buddy with her? She came straight from an outing with His Majesty, Clara replied. I would rather not burden the Prime Minister with strange worries right after something like that. An outing with His Majesty, huh? Leanne. What? I'm just repeating what you're saying. You don't have to make it all weird. Actually, should we tell our boss about it? Clara rose from her desk. Leanne strategically repositioned herself closer to the exit. Anyways, what did she come around for? She wanted to strategize over this winter's policy directives, Clara answered. I am not sure what happened, but she has taken a far more proactive stance when it comes to many of the issues we have discussed in the past. Did she have anything to say about the Beastman thingy? I handed her the report. I doubt we will hear anything official about it until the royal court discusses the matter, but we have Her Excellency's tacit approval to proceed with our operations. On a related note, have you received any word from our Imperial associates? Nor. The girls might have delivered our messages by now, but the Imperials sure as hell ain't using the vampire post. I wouldn't expect the first set of couriers for at least a week. We got what we got and that's all we got. What they got was still a lot. They had 4 barges worth of sample fodder to ship to Roland Gork. According to Ilishnish, the Beastmen's primary source of food was a herd animal called a nug, which was supposedly the jungle cousin of the Nook that populated the Azalizia Mountains. They couldn't assume that both animals ate the same stuff, however. Fortunately, they had no shortage of people volunteering various agricultural goods in hopes that they might find a new market for them. You are practically bouncing in place, Clara told her. Can you blame me? This'll be the biggest deal we've made yet. That was likely the understatement of the century. If things went the way they wanted, the regional economy would be flipped upside down. The magnitude of the disruption would shake most major economic players out of their entrenched positions, giving rise to a mountain of vulnerabilities for Leanne and her friends to exploit. We still have to investigate the market, Clara said. Lady Shawk may have been entirely earnest in our discussions, but there was obviously a lot of information that she either decided to leave out or did not think to include. Also, this is as much a political venture as it is an economic one. The crisis in Roland Gork has opened a door that we did not think would exist for a decade or more, sure, but it's not us that'll be doing all of the damage. We're just innocent merchants innocently doing innocent merchant things. Leanne smiled an innocent smile. The slightest of frowns creased Clara's annoyingly perfect countenance. The Beastmen have merchants of their own, so I hope you are not entertaining any ridiculous fantasies. But those are the best fantasies. Clara rolled her eyes and closed the binders spread out across her desk. She paused to pull a sheet of paper out of one of them. If you have so much energy, she said as she proffered the document, then take a look at this. Let's see, eh? This is the last thing we want to be proactive about. I thought we already settled on a strategy for this. What gives? On the piece of paper was a modest list, but the points on the list were far from modest. They primarily had to do with amendments to legislation and law, particularly in relation to the duchy's urban locales. They are mostly to do with material realities, Clara said. That may be so, Leanne replied, but do you realize how much work needs to go into redoing the city's plumbing to facilitate frost giant privies? I thought that's what the demi-human quarter was supposed to be for. It was merely a stopgap measure. The human population of the Sorceress Kingdom is less than 5% of the total these days, so it is not hard to imagine why the royal court is pushing for everything on that list. Humans may only make up 5% of the kingdom's population, but 100% of the human population lives in the Duchy of Erantal. Wait, don't tell me they plan on scattering us all over the place. Not that I have heard. The point is that, practically speaking, the center of economic and political activity in a country where only a fraction of the population is human is being reserved for human habitation. Of course, the royal court understands that Rantel was originally designed for human habitation, but the fact of the matter is that this problem is better addressed sooner rather than later. Says the people who held 300 city planning committee meetings and never got anywhere, Leanne grumbled. That is probably why the task is being handed down to the House of Lords, Clara said. And that makes this far from a list of material changes, Leanne said. If we're doing this thing, then the other races have to select representatives to participate. We can't exactly decide what they want and need on their behalf. Well, we could, but we'd probably suck at it. It wasn't easy to make a place that suited everyone. Even countries that had centuries to work on the problem still segregated their populations out of necessity. The royal court suddenly deciding that it needed to be done didn't somehow make things any easier. Leanne scratched her head as she frowned over the unreasonable points on the list. It wasn't just demi-human problems. There's just no way we can do this thingy with the guilds. Most of the reason why they've been playing nice with us is because they're making money hand over fist. Do you not think that what they are doing is unfair to everyone else? Clara asked. They are doing what they're supposed to be doing, Leanne answered. And everyone else is everyone else. Challenging the regulatory power of the guilds is an unprecedented amount of overreach by the royal court from the perspective of the guilds. The crown's getting its tolls and trade taxes, and guild-related crime is unheard of, so what's the problem? Leanne went over to the office balcony and plopped herself into a chair. Clara's office offered a commanding view of the Katza River Valley, which included Korlin Harbor. The magically illuminated urban panorama was the subject of much admiration and envy among their imperial guests. Clara didn't waste the opportunity to suggest that they, too, might see similar developments in their territories if they cooperated with the Sorceress Kingdom. So what's the play here? I could see a crackdown on the guilds being a favorable move in the eyes of the nobility, but the bad publicity's gonna kick our asses further abroad. It is a domestic issue more than anything else, Clara told her. The cost of goods and services are being kept artificially high. You didn't have a problem with this before. I did not know what the royal court's stance on the matter was before. They hardly make any forays into this level of governance. Well, now they have. Someone's going to cry, and I doubt it'll be Albedo. Actually, it might be you, since it seems she's dumped the problem onto your lap. It's almost as if she didn't know that we're heading out of the country in a few days. She pulled a gauge block out of one of her pouches and idly fiddled with it, feeling it transform in her hands as she mentally ordered it to take on different weights and dimensions. It was a classic move by the royal court. If they felt that something was beneath them, they tossed it over to the House of Lords. Normally, the nobles would be thrilled at having some say in the overall governance of the country, but the challenges grew increasingly unorthodox over time. They are not demanding a solution immediately, Clara said. We are long past the days when the royal court operated that way. Lady Albedo said that a memorandum will be sent to the other nobles, as well. And they'll be ecstatic about tearing the guilds apart, Leanne snorted. Do the guilds have any say in this? Leanne already knew the answer to that. The victim rarely, if ever, had a say. Initially, they had planned to slowly transform the guilds into something that was more suited to the future realities of the kingdom, which involved having them help reform the education system and gradually putting an end to their cartel operations. This was in line with what the royal court wanted, and Clara was quite clear in her explanation as to what they were doing, but the fact that the royal court was still pushing for change. Did something happen? Clara mentioned something about Albedo. How is this even being proactive? Leanne said, it's not as if we're half-arsing things. We're already doing as much as we can without disrupting the economy. If we push harder than this, then the royal court will complain about the loss in tax revenues. As far as I can tell, Clara said as she came over to sit down in the chair next to hers, she is trying to balance the House of Lords. So she's acting to limit the growth of Lady Shaltir's influence in the Sorceress Kingdom? This may have the effect of doing that, But I doubt that our liege's standing in the royal court is Lady Albedo's primary concern. It is more likely that she is trying to correct perceived inefficiencies, as usual. She was pretty sure that the other nobles would take exception to being referred to as an inefficiency, but that wasn't her problem. Getting subjected to some sort of balancing, however, was. Do you know what she's planning, exactly? Liane asked. To dislodge the guilds, she'll have to begin with accelerating the establishment of public education across the duchy, Clara answered. We've shown significant enough progress in our fiefs that she can push the other nobles into following suit without coming across as arbitrary. The first step towards dislodging the guilds is to break their monopoly on vocational education. Apprentices who aren't inducted into the old guild system would be more inclined to desire free enterprise and trade. The industrial growth of the Sorceress Kingdom and its iron grip on domestic security would provide them with the opportunities that they need to pursue those desires. She and her friends were already spearheading that transition, but the rest of the nobility was still far behind. But it's not as if the other nobles haven't been trying to improve education, Liane said. The bottleneck is teaching staff. Pushing for accelerated reform won't do anything but make every side frustrated. Who knows what the others might come up with? Clara said, the fact that Lady Albedo is doing this means that she is satisfied that the other territories are stable enough to advocate for progress. Well, good luck with that. They may not be a part of Re-Estize anymore, but most of our nobles are still from the old school. The nobles in the western parts of the Sorceress Kingdom were pretty thoroughbred. If they wanted something, they leveraged their connections to obtain it. That usually involved dealing with other nobles or any powerful merchants that they were affiliated with. Ideally, at least to them, that meant consulting with Clara or herself about how to enact the necessary changes that Albedo wanted, but she and Clara would be out of the country by the end of the week. Florine was still working in the Abelian wilderness, and even if they were brave enough to approach Ludmilla, what she was doing out in Warden's Vale was flat out incomprehensible to most. So are we, Clara noted, and so are the imperial aristocrats we have been dealing with. Change comes for everyone, and I am sure that most would like to be on the right side of history. Even if they've been forced, Liane grumbled. I don't see why they deserve the attention. Those who can't adapt should be allowed to fade into obscurity. As a merchant, I agree, Clara said. As a noble, however, leaving people to fall by the wayside is not good governance. Besides, having a diverse set of interests is healthy. The way things are going right now, the Sorceress Kingdom will become little more than a group of powerful companies backed by a peerless military. And what's wrong with that? It sounded ideal to her. Trade was by far the most efficient method of conquest, and the usual way of resisting overwhelming economic might was through physical violence. Having a military ready to retaliate in gratuitously horrifying ways ensured that any potential foes would always play by a merchant's rules. At least if they weren't stupid. If they were, then there was nothing wrong with a bit of war. Practically speaking, Clara said, the other nobles are better suited for dealing with Re-Estize when the time comes. They'll be half a step ahead of their counterparts by the time Lady Albedo's plans should come to fruition, putting them in the ideal position to guide their new allies. Faye. It wasn't as if she couldn't extrapolate the course that the royal court was trying to set for the Sorceress Kingdom. The western territories of the duchy held over 2/3 of the human population, which in turn represented the majority of the Sorceress Kingdom's potential manufacturing base. Since they had so much trouble finding a market for their raw materials and thus suffered from a meager trade surplus, the obvious answer was to induce a demographic shift to urban industry. The methods refined through that initial transition could then be applied to Re-Estize once they inevitably accepted the new realities of the region. Do you think Albedo'll change her tune after we work out a deal with Roland Gork? What is this about Roland Gork? Liane jumped out of her chair and nearly tumbled off of the balcony as Ludmilla materialized into existence behind them. Son of A. Clara had the right idea about attaching a bell to you. Clara rose from her seat and wrapped Ludmilla up in a warm hug. Welcome back, Clara said. How was it? It was interesting, Ludmilla replied. But that's a discussion for later. Many discussions. What were you two talking about? An unexpected opportunity fell onto our laps, Clara said. More like on my head, Leanne said. Someone from Roland Gork fell out of the sky to open trade negotiations. Ludmilla released Clara, taking a step back to regard the two of them with a frown. That seems rather out of character for the Beastmen. You tell me, Leanne shrugged. Apparently, something weird is happening further east and now they're trying to figure out how to not die. Your explanation leaves much to be desired, Ludmilla's frown turned frownier. In short, Clara said, they have an immediate need for meat to stave off starvation for their people and fodder to save their herds. We are still working out the details and several barges are being prepared to deliver sample goods. Several barges? How large is this tribe? Pretty large, Leanne said. This lord is actually trying to negotiate on behalf of the entire Confederation. If her claims are accurate, they can easily outbid most of the region for the stuff that they need. It's going to be grey. Leanne kicked her feet in a panic as Ludmilla grabbed her by the collar and held her at arm's length over the edge of the balcony. The undead noble fixed her with a cold glare. I just had a very long discussion with Lord Mayor and Lady Aura that included how to responsibly manage our economic impact on the region, and then you do this. It's not our economic impact, Leanne protested. We are just delivering goods to where they're demanded. Tell me that your logistical advances have nothing to do with the ability to facilitate this trade. Leanne clicked her tongue. Ludmilla was pretty oblivious when it came to trade and commerce, but she became ridiculously sharp if the topic strayed into logistics and resource management. It was the optimal choice, Clara said. All things considered, this cause will help more people than it harms. And opportunity breeds opportunity, Leanne winked. Carnassus will be in a spectacular mess by the time we get around to dealing with them. With a disgusted snort, Ludmilla discarded her with a flick of her wrist. A wall patrol stopped to watch Leanne as she ricocheted off of the battlements on the way to the ground. She brushed off her dress after disentangling herself from a row of rose bushes. If we let her run the show, nothing would ever happen. Ludmilla was fairly aggressive when it came to changing things up in her own fief, but was an otherwise conscientious person, aggressively conscientious. Leanne wouldn't be surprised if she sat down and conducted in-depth interviews with her enemies before stabbing them. When Leanne returned to the tower office, she carefully poked her head past the doorframe just in case Ludmilla was waiting to toss her off again. The tall noblewoman was leaning against the balcony railing with her arms crossed. Her perpetual frown looked especially foreboding as Clara spoke. Several outcomes will not be pleasant, Clara said, but this is the best we can achieve given the circumstances. There is no way that the royal court would ignore a diplomatic windfall of this magnitude. You spoke with them already? Ludmilla asked. The Prime Minister came by this evening, Clara answered. Speaking of which, there are some matters closer to home that require your attention. It looks like Lady Albedo is satisfied with the progress made in the Western Territories and will be rolling out several new domestic policy objectives. How will they affect our territories? I doubt that they will at all, Clara replied. Ever since last spring, Her Excellency has settled into a strategy of pulling up our kingdom's baseline instead of focusing on singular achievements. This by far promises the greatest gains for the Sorceress Kingdom, so I do not see any reason why she would change things at this point. In less than half a decade, we will begin to see the so-called urban migration that she is aiming for. Ludmilla only shook her head in response. Leanne snuck back to her seat. I don't get it, Leanne said. Weren't you the one that's been desperate for migrants this entire time? At first, yes, Ludmilla replied, but things have changed drastically since then. We have more than enough people living in my territories now. Isn't your population still less than 2,000? There are less than 2,000 humans, Ludmilla said. Going by the latest count, there are over 70,000 demi-humans of various races, mostly goblins. But they're living out in the wilderness, yeah? Lady Albedo won't accept that any more than she'll accept the other nobles not following her blueprint for urbanization. She wants that sweet manufacturing core to improve the kingdom's trade prospects. Which was something that they sorely needed. Not only had the Sorcerer's Kingdom's magic tripled the yields of its crops, but agricultural land utilization was optimized, and the eastern territories that had constantly been subjected to imperial raids were now fully resettled. Even with the use of undead labor and leaning on the industrial power of the dwarves, they were still far from achieving the logistical throughput necessary to keep everything running smoothly. They needed more wagons, warehouses, roads, and ships. Especially more ships. That may be so, Ludmilla said, but both you and the royal court already know that my fief does not share the same economic trajectory as the rest of the duchy. Humph. You just had it easy compared to the rest of us. She really did. From the very beginning, she enjoyed the weird special treatment that Lady Shaltier's vassals received, which made them nearly immune to the royal court's machinations. One might argue that this was because she had taken the initiative far ahead of the rest of the House of Lords and produced various positive results, but that wasn't enough to explain things. It was almost as if Lady Shaltier's vassals were treated as a part of a different political system entirely. This not only manifested in the nearly tangible protection that they enjoyed, but also in the markedly unconventional way in which they were employed. Normally, members of a noble's court worked exclusively for that noble as counselors and advisors, but Lady Shaltier had no qualms about passing them around to her peers. As a result, Clara and Florine spent most of their time doing things for Lady Albedo while Ludmilla worked closely with Lord Mayor, Lady Aura, and Lord Cocytus. Everyone still did work for the Ministry of Transportation, of course, but they were at a point where they were mostly waiting on a long queue of construction projects to finish while the imperial aristocracy sorted things out on their end. It is a good thing that she did, Clara said. Who knows where we would be now if she had not acted as our vanguard. We hardly have the luxury to dwell in the past, Ludmilla said. My contributions were minimal, anyway. Is there anything I should know before I go home? Not staying the night? Clara asked. I have been away for over 2 weeks, Ludmilla answered, and I suspect I am about to be dragged off on some diplomatic adventure. You are not wrong, Clara smiled slightly. We need you to come with us to Roland Gork. Is that a good idea? There are quite a lot of dead beastmen because of me. As far as we could tell, the invasion was a concerted effort by their confederation. Actually, Leanne said, they still don't know it was us. Did you not say that one of their representatives came here to open negotiations? I did, Leanne replied, but it also happened while the Imperials were over. All of the undead were comfortably tucked away out of sight when she arrived, and then we moved her to the roof because she liked it better up there. And for how long do you intend to maintain this deception? Leanne made a face. It's not a deception. We just couldn't figure out a convenient way to broach the topic. You just happen to be a convenient way to broach the topic. Just let us know when you do so we can hide first. I will be sure that you are close at hand when I do, Ludmilla told her. What did Queen Auriculus have to say about this? She doesn't have to say anything, Leanne said. This is between us and Roland Gork. We will be conferring with Her Majesty in Auriculon on the way there, Clara said. She seems to favor you, which is another reason why you are coming. When do we depart? Cargo deliveries from all of our interested parties should finish loading by midnight, Clara said. We will be joining the convoy after it arrives at Auriculon. I see. Well, hopefully, nothing too involved will be waiting for me in Warden's Vale. With that, Ludmilla turned around and disappeared into the night. Leanne peered into the gloom for several moments after she lost sight of her, just in case she reappeared to do something terrifying. I'm surprised you didn't go with her, Leanne said. Me? Why? What do you mean why? You're the one sitting there looking all needy. Clara frowned, shifting in her seat while smoothing down her skirts. I am not. Aha. You also forgot to bring up the Liam thing. Liam is busy working at the moment, Clara said. It would be better if he was not being distracted by deadly threats. Welcome back, Lady Zaradnik. Thank you, Leluvian, Ludmilla replied with a warm smile. How has everyone fared during my absence? I can't say that much has changed, the half-elf maid replied. The druids say that the upper reaches will start seeing snow by the end of the month, so most everyone's attention's on the timing of the harvest. It is about that time of the year, Ludmilla said. I suppose many of the migrants have not experienced a true winter in their lifetimes. Things shouldn't be as crazy as last year when barely anyone had seen snow before, but I don't doubt that Nonna will be especially stringent about winterization procedures this year. Did anything even happen last year? Aside from a few injuries from slipping on the ice, no. Now that you've got me thinking about it, the tribes in the upper reaches are starting to lay claim to their overwintering grounds. In general, they've moved according to your predictions, my lady. Encouraging news, Ludmilla nodded. Which tribes acted out of the ordinary? The Chip-Tooth, Wounded Wyvern, and Gronk tribes remain where they settled on the northeastern shores of the lake this summer. A few independent goblin troops have split off and set up camps between the highway and the northwestern shore. What about the southern shore? Leluvian shook her head. The tribe's history with the theocracy still makes them wary of overwintering too far south. According to some of the chiefs, it's the season when they are usually attacked. That makes sense. The strategic logic was easy enough to follow. Normally, the wilderness tribes would retreat to the warmth of the countless shallow caves scattered across the highland basin during the winter months, using them as bases from which hunters and foragers would range for food and fuel. The pragmatic practice practically pinned them in place, making it easy for theocracy forces to periodically exterminate them en masse. Have you had the chance to speak with any of the merchants plying the river trade? Ludmilla asked. No, my lady, Leluvian answered. I only know as much as the army does. No violent interactions have been reported by the merchants, neither have any been observed by our patrols. Ludmilla made her way over to the office to see what the tax records had to say about her fief's nascent river trade. Unsurprisingly, Nonna was nowhere to be seen. The elder lich treated the territory's productivity as the principal measure of her worth as a member of the kingdom's administration, and the harvest was still by far the largest source of official industrial output. Is Glaser still at the school? She asked as she rifled through the most recent reports. She came back just after sunset, Leluvian answered. I believe she's out doing her rounds. Will you be having dinner tonight? I might drop by the restaurant for something later, but I need to get as much as I can done right now. Apparently, I will be out of the kingdom in a day or two. Apparently, my lady? Countess Corlin conscripted me when I stopped by her place on the way here, Ludmilla said. We will be going to Rolengork. Rolengork, will you require our assistance? The military will not be involved, it is a purely diplomatic mission. Any security arrangements will have been made on Corlin's end. Since the Beastman Lord from Rolengork wasn't aware that the Sorceress Kingdom was the source of the undead army that their ill-fated migration attempt had encountered, Ludmilla suspected that she was what amounted to their security arrangements. If worst came to worst, at least they had their shadow demons. How do you think the Beastmen will react, Leluvian? To the fact that we killed millions of their people, my lady? Honestly, I'm not sure. In my experience, the tribes are primarily concerned with their day-to-day matters. Even a bad history with other tribes or whatnot doesn't bother them so long as it doesn't represent an existential threat. They're not so different from us, really. From what we saw during the Draconic Kingdom campaign, the Beastmen of Rolengork have a far more complex society than the tribes around here, but the fact that they sent migrants implies that those who perished were unwanted in the first place. The hard part is convincing them that we are not an existential threat, Ludmilla sighed. Well, our offensive stopped at the border, didn't it? It did, but I do not doubt that they understand our forces would have extreme difficulties advancing in the jungle. Their defensive deployments along the border suggest that they were confident in their chances. Doesn't that also suggest that they aren't as fearful of us as my lady imagines? Perhaps. Still, it is hard to believe that attitudes against the undead could be overcome so simply. I will just have to see how things are when we get there. The cry of a cranky child rose from the plants in the hall, followed by another shortly after. Leluvian's footsteps whispered from the kitchen and past the entrance to the office. The soothing tones of the young, at least young by half-elf standards, mother's voice sounded shortly after. Ludmilla went to her simple wooden desk to read through the harbor records. It looks like the merchants are still doing an excellent job. Those from the heartlands might have scoffed at what they would consider pitiful volumes of trade, but, to her, the numbers represented the most recent in a long sequence of exciting successes. In the spring following the Goblin army's invasion of the upper reaches, groups of desperate defenders like Sun Rock broke back up into countless independent tribes that slowly hunted and foraged their way across the severely depopulated basin in search of unclaimed territory. Some of that population inevitably interacted with the humans building the town on the lake. After a few weeks of promising reports, Ludmilla went on the offensive by encouraging the river trade. It was especially ideal for the up-and-coming batch of lizardman merchants, who preferred staying near water and close to home. Given the tribe's history with the theocracy, sending demi-humans likely also made things easier. The brutally practical perspective that life in the wilderness demanded meant that the tribes wouldn't turn their noses up at the potential advantages offered by trade. That included the lizardmen, who had also relatively recently embraced what the industries of the Sorceress Kingdom had to offer and would be able to lean on that experience while trading along the river. Slowly, but surely, both sides became familiar with one another and flourished in their own little way. Not every tribe took advantage of the river trade, of course. Even if they overcame their wariness of outsiders, the tribes that got ahead of them were protective of the advantages that they had gained. The three that Leluvian mentioned were among the first to benefit from what the lizardmen offered and did what they could to keep potential competitors at bay, as access to equipment produced in Warden's Vale had a drastic impact on their lives. What would happen next was of particular interest to her. Due to the interference of the slain theocracy, none of the local tribes ever grew powerful enough to dominate a large swathe of the upper reaches. It wouldn't just be a matter of who had access to trade, of course. Better equipment might help with day-to-day issues such as reliable provisioning and light raids, but the real test would come when the various upstarts drew the attention of more powerful individuals. Overall, how each tribe and race acted and reacted over the seasons would provide invaluable information as to how populations in similar situations abroad might be affected by the Sorceress Kingdom's expanding economic reach. For Ludmilla, it would help inform future changes to law and governance, which would in turn hopefully serve as a model that demonstrated how the Sorcerer King's mandates for racial harmony might be achieved. That was a long-term venture, however. For the time being, she needed to get several things going before she left the country. No emergencies had been reported, but she still had to get her rangers started on their winter training, discuss how the Commanders' League might be expanded, finalize arrangements for the winter harvest, and spend some time speaking with her people. She doubtless had an endless line of experiments, project proposals, and test results to examine, as well, but that would have to wait until later. Even as a tireless undead being, I still cannot find enough time to do everything. Living for an eternity meant little when so many things needed to be done now. She enjoyed her work and liked being busy, but it would have been nice if things happened at a manageable pace. Ludmilla finished sorting out her documents and placed them into the infinite haversack on her right hip before leaving her manor. She took in a lungful of crisp Highland air as she stepped back out into the village square. Despite how busy things were, things hadn't changed much physically. There were a few new houses on one side of the village to replace the ones being recycled on the other. The patches of dirt that Glazer scattered over the otherwise barren stone landscape were a little bit greener. With it being so late at night, at least by rural standards, most of the villagers were relaxing and socializing near the magically lit storefronts along the western edge of the square, except it didn't quite look like they were. She strolled over to see what was going on, spotting Nonna and Glaza with a full patrol of Death Knights standing at the edge of a large gathering. The villagers all faced the entrance of the apparel outlet, many bearing stern expressions. Ludmilla went to stand with the Dryad and the Elder Lich, draping an arm over Glaza's shoulder and hugging her to her side. "Nonna, what is going on here?" "This one believes that an agent from the city is attempting to incite an insurrection. However, enforcement protocols for this particular scenario do not exist. Permission to liquidate the threat." An insurrection? Had her subjects found her lacking in some aspect of her rule? She couldn't recall doing anything unreasonable, but she was admittedly young and inexperienced as a noble. "What has this agent been saying?" she asked. "In summary, the agent is challenging the processes of our urban industries and encouraging the citizens to adopt inefficient methods practiced elsewhere." Ludmilla bit her lower lip in vexation. They had finally come. She knew it would happen eventually, but this was far too soon. "Lady Zaradnik?" As if sensing her anxiety, Glaza snaked one of her vines around Ludmilla's arm. Ludmilla gave the Dryad's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Do not worry," she said. "I will go and speak with this agent." She made her way around the back of the crowd until she reached the row of storefronts. As expected, she found a member of the Merchant Guild addressing the villagers. "Miss Hoffman," Ludmilla said. "Welcome to Warden's Vale." Edwina Hoffman froze mid-speech. She turned to offer Ludmilla a respectful curtsy. "Baroness Zaradnik. Thank you for your welcome. You have a beautiful home. I only wish I could have paid a visit under less alarming circumstances." "Oh?" Ludmilla smiled, "and what might those alarming circumstances be?" The guild official held up a stack of documents in front of her, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles. "Several of our affiliate guilds have made certain allegations about your outlet in the city. Upon further investigation, we discovered a number of problems that are both anomalous and concerning." "Who brought forward these allegations?" Ludmilla asked. "We are not obliged to disclose this information," Miss Hoffman answered. "Rest assured, my lady, our internal investigation has proven these issues to be very much real. The guild members here in Warden's Vale have also confirmed our findings." Ludmilla's gaze went to her assembled subjects. A few of them shrugged in response. "Please refrain from coercing statements from our members, my lady," Miss Hoffman said. "What did I do?" "I would hear these allegations," Ludmilla said. "For the time being, the guild has two demands. The first is to adhere to the organization's regulations when it comes to issuing licenses." "As far as I know," Ludmilla said, "I have been adhering to your regulations." "Your operations indicate otherwise," the official said as she gestured to the building behind her. "In a word, they are unfair." "Unfair?" "On multiple levels," Miss Hoffman nodded. "To begin with, artisans here may only work as employees of your chartered companies, through which they must apply for certification by the guilds. I do not see what is wrong with that." The guild official released an audible sigh. "It is an uncompetitive practice," Miss Hoffman told her. "Why would the guilds take exception to this when workshop owners in the city effectively do the same thing? Workshop employees still apply and act as independent entities. They do not run the workshops that they work in, they subcontract work from the workshop owner and have personal workstations." "If that is the case," Ludmilla said, "then my companies create a far more equitable environment for its employees than any workshop in the city." "I cannot comprehend how you can say that," the guild official scoffed. "The employees decide how the company is run," Ludmilla said. "Yet you own the company," Miss Hoffman noted. "You can put an end to any activities that you don't approve of." "I would only do that if it was a part of my duty as the ruler of this territory. Every company has its own administrators and affiliated merchants who take care of the business end of things." It seemed like the obvious way to run a company, at least according to the tenets of her faith. Everyone did what they were supposed to be doing and the organization prospered as a result. "You will forgive me if this idealistic claim is met with a healthy dose of speculation, Lady Zaradnik," Miss Hoffman said. The aristocracy has a proven history of interfering with the guilds. Rather than argue in circles, however, let us discuss how your operations threaten the economy of the Sorceress Kingdom. Ludmilla crossed her arms, trying to figure out what in the world she was referring to. She was doing everything that she could to keep her territorial economy relevant to her people. Now, suddenly, what she was doing was a threat to the entire kingdom. Explain, Ludmilla said. Everything that you are doing is or is projected to produce inventories that exceed your territory's ability to absorb, Miss Hoffman told her. Furthermore, the excess is exported and impacts markets in other parts of the Sorceress Kingdom. What you are doing is robbing people of their livelihoods. The guilds have always carefully regulated industry to ensure that this never becomes the case. My fief's industrial production is relatively tiny compared to the other territories, never mind the city, Ludmilla said. Yet seeing what you are doing here, it is readily apparent that it won't be the case within the next generation. The guild would prefer to rein in such issues before they can cause too much damage. My people are only doing what they believe is right. Which is another problem, the guild official told her. You appear to be extending exclusive invitations to migrants who worship the 6 great gods. The abundance of free resources in this territory combined with your religious practices are culminating into a critical issue for the Sorceress Kingdom. Ludmilla couldn't help but roll her eyes. Oh, yes, she said, the superior quality of our products will surely bring ruin to every land that they touch. This is not a laughing matter, my lady. Then state your case plainly, Ludmilla said. I am a half-step away from tying you to a log and floating you back down the river. The young woman visibly paled. It appeared that Ludmilla's efforts to be more approachable had led people to forget who and what she was. She would have to remedy that at some point. Everything has to do with the economy, my lady, Miss Hoffman said. The faith of the 6, it doesn't follow the logic of the markets. Your people are producing goods for the sake of producing them, ignoring the fundamental principles of supply and demand. Normally, people would call that honing one's craft. Normally, the guild official said, people who are honing their craft do so within their means. These companies you have chartered are less businesses and more studios that you preside over as the sole patron. Instead of patronizing the fine arts, however, you are spending money on mundane craft. Does it not make more sense to support mundane craft and the fine arts? Ludmilla asked. Her question was met with a dumbfounded stare. Ludmilla supposed that her logic was backwards according to the common sense of the region. Many nobles took pride in the idea that they were keepers of culture and collected pieces of art as a result. Most, however, came to the understanding that art was merely an expression of culture rather than culture in itself, so art became more a store of wealth than anything else. She was in no position to do such things, however, and wouldn't be for the indeterminate future. Miss Hoffman's expression shifted to one of exasperation. What I am trying to say, my lady, is that your expenditures are unnecessary. More than that, you are meddling in the local economy with your irrational and uncompetitive practices. I fail to understand this assertion about uncompetitive practices, Ludmilla replied. You appear to believe that I am fueling the growth of these companies with personal wealth, but they all have operating budgets that are internally managed. That's impossible, Miss Hoffman laughed. The facilities here far exceed the means of regular artisans. It is a fact that they would not exist without your support. Investing in economic infrastructure is hardly a strange thing to do for a noble, Ludmilla noted. Referring to this as economic infrastructure is a stretch, my lady. Roads, bridges, and harbors do not harm the business of our members. Does Clara have to deal with this? In any case, it was getting annoying. The guilds plainly didn't like what was going on in Warden's Vale and they were trying to put an end to it on the premise of protecting their members and the economy at large. In reality, however, it was institutional conservatism attempting to crush an upstart. The guilds tended to get what they wanted because they had a stranglehold on so many industries, so it was safe to assume that they fully expected her to defer to them. This discussion does not seem to be getting us anywhere, Ludmilla said. What is the full extent of the Guild's demands? Miss Hoffman went through the documents in her hand, stopping to withdraw a crisp sheet of noble paper and clearing her throat. First, the thoughtless issue of licenses in this fief must come to an end. Even if you refuse to comply, we will not recognize any new artisans operating here, apprentice or otherwise. Their goods, of course, will be similarly blacklisted anywhere in the world that the guilds operate. What else? Ludmilla asked. Secondly, the fraudulent practices which led to the recognition of dozens of members by our organization will be answered with the immediate expulsion of said individuals by the guilds. Ludmilla felt a frown tug at the corner of her lips. Fraudulent? What in the world are you talking about? Our associates have drawn attention to the unprecedented rise of several individuals working for your companies. We conducted an investigation at their behest and found the applications to be suspiciously limited in information. Upon my arrival in Warden's Vale, I discovered that we had been tricked into conferring master's status on a group of children. We will not stand for this flouting of our standards. Those children submitted their masterpieces just like anyone else would, Ludmilla said. Are you implying that the assessment of your judges was flawed in some way? Of course not, Miss Hoffman said. They are all respected senior members of their respective guilds. As much as we would love to entertain the notion of a rare prodigy, it is far more likely that the masterpieces of this whole gaggle of prodigies were illegitimate submissions. If the guilds so desire, Ludmilla said, my artisans will be more than happy to dispel your doubts about their work. You may choose to challenge our ruling, the guild official said. Our members are quite busy, however. I'm sure you understand this. Yes, of course. When is the soonest opportunity? The spring after sowing. That is nearly 5 months from now. It is, Miss Hoffman nodded. You should also understand that the candidates awaiting reassessment will not be allowed to put their marks on any of their goods until their skills are proven. But they will not be able to sell anything if they do not. Those are the regulations, Lady Zaradnik. Ludmilla idly entertained the idea of doing more than tying the woman to a log, but it probably wouldn't change the position of the guilds. Is there anything else? Ludmilla asked. Yes, my lady, Miss Hoffman answered. It has come to our attention that marriages are being arranged without our approval. As a noble, you have the right to manage the family affairs of your rural tenants, but the guilds have always done this for urban centers. This is for the good of the economy, of course. Unregulated unions only lead to chaos. Marriage in Warden's Vale is an institution ordained by the temples of the Six, Ludmilla told her. That may be so, Miss Hoffman replied, but guild members who choose to marry without the approval of their guild will have their memberships revoked and their work blacklisted. This is getting increasingly ridiculous. She crossed her arms as the guild official went through a long list of things that she could and could not do. There was no legal precedent for any of it, but it didn't matter. They held so much influence over industry and urban society that they had become self-appointed protectors of the economy. Now, she was being delivered an ultimatum long before the Sorceress Kingdom was ready to oust them from their entrenched position. Oh, and one last thing, Lady Zaradnik. Ludmilla looked up from her thoughts with a questioning look. In the guild official's hand was an article of clothing that Ludmilla had just recently approved for sale in her city outlet. You cannot sell items like these, my lady, Miss Hoffman told her. Why not? Ludmilla asked. Because they are a dire threat to the economy, the woman answered. A dire threat? Ludmilla furrowed her brow. Unless I am mistaken, Miss Hoffman, you are holding a blouse. It is not just any blouse, Miss Hoffman replied. You know that as well as I do. I do, and it is precisely the reason why I approved them for sale. They are self-cleaning items that are impervious to the wear and tear of everyday activities. Even if they do get damaged somehow, they can be magically repaired for no material cost so long as they are not completely destroyed. Exactly. That's why you cannot sell these. Her gaze went from the shirt in Miss Hoffman's hand to the guild official's completely serious expression. Miss Hoffman, Ludmilla said, You will forgive me for not being able to understand why anything I mentioned is a dire threat to the economy. Miss Hoffman took on a long-suffering tone. It's obvious, isn't it? You're selling an item that lasts forever barring some catastrophic event. An artisan cannot make a living selling things that only need to be purchased once. Markets that distribute goods of this nature will inevitably stagnate and die. I see. Thank you for your cooperation, Lady Zaradnik. The guild official smiled and turned to leave. Now, I believe the next ship is departing in. Stop. The woman froze in place. I never said I would comply with your demands, Ludmilla said. Surely you don't mean that, my lady. I do. I have long considered the problematic nature of this economy that you constantly refer to, and our discussion has only served to strengthen my convictions on the matter. I understand that you are merely a representative of the guilds and that your organization believes that it is working in the best interests of its people, so I hope you will understand that I am similarly acting in the best interests of mine. But how can that be? Miss Hoffman said, do you even understand what you're saying? This is war. Ludmilla smiled coldly, in a manner of speaking. I pray that the guilds will keep things civil, for your own sakes.